Our focus today is on virtual exchange and mobility, access, integration, and internationalization. I'm Chris Glass, an affiliated faculty member with the Center for International Higher Education and the director of the executive doctoral program here at Boston College. Today's conversation explores virtual exchange and mobility across multiple contexts, geographies, parts of the world, regional perspectives, but also from three very different perspectives. I think you'll enjoy the rich diversity our panelists will bring. We're joined by panelists from all over the world who will explore important questions related to virtual exchange, including how quality is ensured in virtual exchanges and how those are being integrated and accredited by higher education institutions, the role of virtual mobility in expanding access to higher education, and mapping the very complicated and fast-growing landscape of virtual exchange programs and participants, including who is participating in virtual exchange, where it is occurring across the world, and in what forms. Although the pandemic has put a spotlight on virtual exchange and mobility, certainly this is not new to the field. This work has been underway for many years. Virtual exchange and mobility is also an area where there is a lot of new research, and we're certainly in the early stages of development. And you'll hear some of the key research studies presented in today's conversation. A few housekeeping just notes before we begin our conversation today. We will automatically mute all participants, and we ask that if you're not a presenter to go ahead and turn off your video. This will help with bandwidth issues to make sure it's a great experience for everyone who's joining us today. Today's format will include short 10 to 15 minute presentations where each panelist presents so that we have about 15 or 20 minutes for your questions. If you have questions along the way, you can put those in the chat box. We're going to be monitoring that throughout the presentations, and we will be synthesizing those questions and then posing them to the panelists. Today's webinar will be recorded, and that recording will be shared with you and more broadly as well. So the presentations and conversations among our panelists today will provide a rich and intellectual discussion and exchange. And I'm excited to introduce our first panelist, Sara Pittarello. Sara is talking about today the EU Frames project that is focused on scenarios for the integration of virtual exchange in higher education through the Frames report. Sara is a freelance interpreter and an expert evaluator of EU projects. She collaborated with UNICollaboration as a project manager and outreach officer in this initiative. And UNICollaboration is one of the EU Frames partner. I'm going to turn it to Sara, who will share her presentation.
Thank you, Chris. And it is indeed a pleasure to participate in this valuable conversation. And I'll try to be brief and to be up to the expectations of these I'm an extreme diverse audience. So I'll briefly just explain to you what the Frames project is all about. Frames is a strategic partnership project lasting 2 years and funded by the Erasmus Plus scheme, meaning that it is funded by the European Commission. And it was born to respond to two great challenges, which are how to design and implement blended mobility schemes, which are intercultural and inclusive, and how to integrate and accredit blended mobility activities as a stable component of the academic offer. The key aim is hence to foster a harmonized implementation and accreditation of blended mobility among higher education institutions, first in Europe and beyond. No need for me to list the partners. You can see the logos of the partners on the bottom of this slide. I will try to enter into the deep of my presentation by focusing on potential ways to integrate and accredit virtual exchange at higher education level, which is the focus of a report which has just recently been published by the Frames Consortium. And I'll then share with you in the chat the link where you can find the report available online. The report is one of the outputs of the Frames project planned outputs, and it has been drafted for higher education institution staff interested in implementing virtual exchange at higher education level. The aim was to show how virtual exchange has been integrated and accredited by higher education institutions. And this is done by illustrating selected cases. These cases have been selected after a mapping activity based on a pattern analysis methodology. That is, we looked at 2 reports, the Evolve report and a collection of virtual exchange case studies, a recent publication edited by Francesca, Helm and Anna Böven. And then we circulated an open survey among our partners and contacts. And out of all the cases we collected, we were able to map 71 cases, identify common threads and patterns among these cases so as to select some of them, namely 12. And these 12 cases have been grouped according to the patterns they follow, according to potential scenarios. And hence 4 scenarios have been identified, which I will list in the following slide. Depending on whether the virtual exchange is first, a preparatory or follow-up activity to physical mobility, or second scenario, whether it is an intertwined component of a physical mobility. Bear in mind that in the first 2 scenarios, we find virtual exchange as deeply linked to the physical mobility experience. So we are referring to blended mobility. In case of virtual exchange is a standalone learning activity, we are dealing with a different scenario. Scenario 3. Fourth scenario is whether the virtual exchange is a component of a course, be it traditional or online. In the following slide, you can see a table summarizing the key features of each of these scenarios. When we have a virtual exchange as a preparatory or follow-up activity to physical mobility, we see that the virtual exchange takes place either before or after the mobility exchange. And of course, depending on whether it takes place, whether on the aim, of course, it varies. The focus is on the preparation to the exchange, if the virtual exchange takes place before, or on making students reflect on the experience. In this case, the virtual exchange takes place after. The main and key aims are the creation of bonds and reinforcing internationalization at home. Very frequently, we find different cohorts of students being put in connection together because we have, for example, the case of a virtual exchange in dentistry between a university from the United States and a British university. And in this case, we have various cohorts of students, mobile students, matching with each other. In the second scenario, we find that the virtual exchange is intertwined with physical mobility into a single educational experience, which can take place either before, after, and also while students are abroad in a while abroad module. In this case, the virtual exchange is part of a specific initiative. It can be a summer school, an annual conference, or a project-based initiative. What is the common element is the fact that the virtual exchange activities are linked to the mobility experience. Let's move on to this third scenario where we have a virtual exchange recognized as an individual activity, which is offered within a degree. This degree is focusing on either practical activities, a practical experience, or it may be offered as a compulsory or elective course or as a general course in a framework of courses dealing with transversal competencies, for example. The aim behind this kind of virtual exchange projects is to support internationalization at home and inclusion. Fourth scenario, in this case, virtual exchange is an integral and required part of the course, and recognition is linked to the other course requirements. In this specific case, the virtual exchange is added to the course to give an international dimension, and the virtual exchange itself is used to support course learning objectives. In the following table, you can see the examples, the cases which have been selected, the 12 cases I mentioned before. 4 of them have been highlighted in orange. These are the ones I will briefly introduce to you to give you an idea of each scenario. So first, let's start with the IESALC preparation project, which is a preparatory activity to the mobility being offered to undergraduate students from an Irish and a Spanish institution. And in fact, the disciplines involved are English and Spanish. And these students are set to go abroad after in the following semester, and they have to complete a series of online tasks working in pairs or small groups over 8 weeks. Of course, topics you can imagine are about expectations about living abroad, comparisons between the university and academic systems in the two countries. The great opportunities behind this kind of virtual exchange is the psychological preparation. Students have demonstrated to reduce their anxiety, and they increase their motivation regarding the period abroad. And long-lasting links are established between the two cultures. Students can also benefit from an authentic linguistic experience and can develop intercultural learning. What is the key challenge in this case? Of course, the great asymmetry between, in terms of language proficiency, in terms of type of mobility, in terms of motivation, accreditation, and similar aspects. Let's move on to the second scenario. In this case, I have taken the example of an intertwined component of a physical mobility, mentioning the Yerovi virtual exchange initiative. This is organized within a network of institutions, gathering every year for an annual one-week conference where students and the teachers from this network are together. Students who have previously worked in teams from 2 to 3 institutions worked on a project online during the months before the Euroweek event. And while participating in this final annual conference, they shared the results of their research projects and they compete for prizes as well. What are the great opportunities of this kind of virtual exchange initiatives? First of all, the inclusive and diverse student body and the fact that the projects on which they work are highly multidisciplinary. Students have been very, very satisfied with the results and with the activities carried out. And these activities are accredited. In this case, the virtual exchange is accredited. Yet, accreditation varies according to the local institution, which can also be a great challenge. In terms of challenges, the fact that most relies on the investment by the single institutions is indeed a burden, as is the fact that the international dimension recognition goes somewhat lost. Moving on to the third scenario, here I wanted to show you an example of a teacher training virtual exchange initiative being implemented between the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany and the University of Latvia, where we have students working together for 10 weeks online, covering 5 learning modules. As you can imagine here, they are provided with an overview of primary education, but in an international comparison. And students investigate the basics of teaching and learning, assessment at primary schools. They work on assignments, focusing on similarities and differences within the education systems of these two countries. The great opportunity is the fact that here we have a clear example of how virtual exchange can help to internationalize the curriculum. And of course, this virtual exchange goes into the direction of an internationalization at home strategy, also due to the fact that students can opt for a physical experience. This is optional, not compulsory, at the end of this virtual exchange initiative. And this is something which has been added upon later on. It was not this physical mobility, which consists in a very short mobility experience for 1 week in the form of a conference, was not there when the virtual exchange was established, showing the high flexibility and even the hybrid nature of these scenarios that we have tried to identify. The key challenge here is the accreditation and recognition, which is different. And of course, this may result in different motivation as well. Fourth scenario. Here, I have mentioned the example of a broadening module offered by the University of Limerick, which is the communication across cultures, where we have a pedagogical approach following a blended mobility model. Face-to-face lectures take place in the first part, And then in the second part, we have a series of IUCs, meaning interactive online, open online courses in which students are required to participate. This series of IUCs is the Cultural Encounters program offered by Sharing Perspectives Foundation, which is a professional institution offering ready-made virtual exchange projects. The great opportunity behind this virtual exchange is the inclusive approach to internationalization, and especially the fact that the virtual exchange is automatically accredited as it is a component of a course. Yet in terms of challenges, we see that the workload risks to be very, very heavy if the workload of the course is not aligned to that of and adjusted based on the virtual exchange assignments. And to the same end, learning outcomes of the virtual exchange and of the course need to be aligned. Here, a high investment is required in terms of human and financial resources, but this, it must be said that this is also a common feature in all virtual exchanges. This is the last scenario. Based on that, we have felt the need to train staff. And that's why we have offered a pilot training for the consortium partners. And we are now opening it to up to 100 participants. This is the very last slide. I just wanted to give you in a snapshot the idea of what you will see if you decide to participate in this free online training, which will last 4 weeks from the 2nd to the 29th of May, and which is addressing in a single word internationalization staff, be it teaching or administrative staff, provided that they might be concerned with virtual exchange. This is all, and I'll leave the floor back to Chris, and thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate your presentation. Next, we have the next two presenters who can begin sharing their screen. Takudzwa, Mutize, and then Clarisa Yerovi from UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. They'll be presenting on virtual student mobility for a post-pandemic world. Takudzwa is a junior policy analyst at UNESCO. He has worked for the African Capacity Developing Foundation, the United Nations Development Program, and UNESCO in conducting research, producing knowledge, and facilitating content development to provide governments the tools they need for development work. Clarisa is also a junior policy analyst at UNESCO and has served in several capacities, including the Ministry of Education in Peru. Again, we'll be approaching virtual exchange and mobility from a different context, this time focusing much more on virtual mobility, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone from different parts of the world. I'm Takudzwa, and together with my colleague Clarisa from the UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, we're excited to be part of this webinar series and to present to you some findings from our global case studies of virtual student mobility. And I'll ask Clarisa to move to the next slide, please. And before we move to the findings of our project, I'd like to introduce you to our institute. And some of you may be familiar with UNESCO's work, but may not have heard about UNESCO IESALC. So we are based in Caracas, Venezuela, and the institute was created in 1997 with a view to promote the right to higher education through capacity development for the formulation of quality, equitable, and inclusive higher education policies in LAC member states, and with a view to have a global outreach. And realizing the importance of evidence-based policy making, the Institute has a global team of researchers and policy analysts, and we're taking advantage of the technology and internet that is available to be working virtually due to the pandemic, so in different parts of the world. Next slide, please. So the Institute has 4 strategic areas for the coming 4 years, which are committing to higher education as a universal right to a public good, And the second one is to empower institutions and higher education systems for a more responsive, inclusive, relevant, and efficient provision. And the third one is to nurture innovation in higher education. And the fourth one is to re-envision internationalization. And as you can see, how the virtual student mobility project fits into the fourth strategic direction, although it also links with the other directions, which is innovation in higher education, responsiveness and inclusiveness. And all these also form part of the right to higher education. Next slide, please. So the first stage of the project was to establish how student mobility was before the pandemic and how COVID-19 impacted student mobility. And from this stage, our summary of the findings, which you can see from this infographic, which we presented at various conferences, and it's also on our website, and there's also a video on YouTube. On the first stage of the findings, we found that student mobility was exclusive and concentrated in particular regions of the world, and it also had a significant carbon footprint. And we found that due to the travel disruptions caused by the pandemic, some institutions took advantage of technology and the internet and are now moving to their physical mobility programs to virtual forms. And that's how we got interest into studying how institutions around the world are implementing and operationalizing virtual student mobility and how are students actually experiencing it. So some of you are familiar with the terms COIL and virtual exchange as used in the last presentation. We took components and understandings of these two terms, and we've come up with a more inclusive term of virtual student mobility, which is a form of mobility that uses ICT to facilitate cross-border and/or inter-institutional, academic, cultural, and experiential exchanges and collaborations. Next slide, please. So the aims of our project were to assess the operationalization of virtual student mobility in a global perspective and to establish key challenges and enablers in implementing virtual student mobility. And from these key challenges and enablers to provide recommendations to higher education institutions and policymakers, which can be at national level, to embed virtual modalities of student mobility. And I'll pass on to Clarisa to tell us more about the findings from the student survey.
Thank you, Takudzwa, and greetings to everyone in the room. So in order to develop a report, we selected 14 case studies around the world, 10 institutional case studies, and this map, the first map, shows you the 10 institutional case studies that we have. If each color represents one of the case studies, and by institutional case studies, we mean one higher education institution or more leading a virtual student mobility program. But while we were doing our interviews for the institutional case studies, we realized the importance of alliances in promoting virtual student mobility across the world. That's why we added in our report 4 case studies, alliances case studies, and this second map shows you the 4 alliances that we work with. In total, we covered 73 higher education institutions around the world in 38 countries. And as you can see, we try to cover every region in the world. We try to cover different types of ESM programs. We try to cover, for example, programs that had different time zone differences, programs that have different languages. And in order to develop this 14 case studies, we did interviews and a student survey. These interviews were with the purpose of understanding the virtual student mobility programs from the perspective of faculty and international office staff members. We interviewed 32 of them. It was more than 20 hours of interview. The interviews were conducted online in both English and Spanish. But we also wanted to know the students' perspective, and that's why we developed a student survey, also online, also in English and Spanish. It was sent only to institutional case studies, and in total, we received 107 valid responses from students at 17 higher education institutions in 12 countries. Now, we want to be mindful of time, and we have a lot of findings. So we are focusing this time on the student survey results. So first, the first thing we noticed from the results of the student survey is that students have limited understanding of virtual student mobility. Most students are new to virtual student mobility. 3 out of 4 students were not familiar with virtual student mobility before their virtual student mobility experience. Another thing that we found out was that higher education institutions play an important role in raising awareness about new mobility programs. 62% of students came across their BSM experience through their home higher education institution. We then asked students, why did they took part of their BSM experience? And overwhelmingly, 82 students selected experiencing academically challenging or enriching. This is interesting to see that the academic component of virtual student mobility is on top of other components according to students. We have then experience providing international work experience, and then as a third choice, could not travel due to the pandemic. This is also interesting considering that in most of our case studies, the BSM programs started or were modified from previous physical mobility programs due to the pandemic and due to the travel restrictions. Then another interesting result from this question is that in the box you can see financial reasons, environmental reasons, and the flexibility time reasons that people would choose to do BSM experience. These are the reasons that normally we hear from faculty or funders. However, these were not as important for students as you can see in this slide. Now, we also asked students to evaluate their BSM experiences, first by asking them what was the best part of their virtual student mobility experience. There were more options in the survey, however, we're only highlighting the top 3 ones. So we have flexibility in planning workload, more convenient to stay at home, and cheaper than traveling abroad, which highlights the aspects of flexibility and convenience of virtual student mobility experience. And this is particularly important because it shows that virtual student mobility can expand access to students who are carers, students who are part-time students, students who are working, that maybe don't have the means or the time or the flexibility in their schedule to do a physical mobility experience, but they can do a virtual student mobility experience. Now, we also asked students what was the most challenging part of their BSM experience. And in the top question, the top result that we had was problems with internet connection. And this was true not just for countries in the global south, this was true across all of our case studies, except one, showing that internet connection is the biggest challenge still. We then have time zone differences, and indeed we have case studies with big time zone differences. We have one that had 23 hours, but the students that selected time zone differences as a challenging aspect of their BSM experience were the ones from case studies that had 5 to 6 hour time zone differences. So this is something to be mindful when planning future virtual student mobility experience. And in the third and the fourth place, we have getting timely quality feedback, and teaching supervision was lower quality than in person. They have similar numbers, but if you add them up, they're even more, these two options, they're even more answers than problems with internet connection, which shows us to not forget academic quality while doing BSM programs. Then continuing this evaluation of the BSM experience, 56% of students said they were very satisfied with their BSM experience. 62% of students said they would very likely or likely recommend virtual student mobility to others, and 74% would do virtual student mobility again if they have the chance. So this is quite positive. This is a good start considering the lack of experience and awareness of students to be virtual student mobility, as one of the first slides show. And this is also reflected in this first quote that I'm going to read to you. It was a delightful experience. It made my day better. But however, some students didn't like it. So we have another quote from the student survey from a student that said, didn't like it, do it online. And in the next slide, I'm going to show you a couple of things to be mindful of when thinking of virtual student mobility in the future. So first, 37% of students ask for more interaction to improve their virtual student mobility experience. Again, these are quotes that we pulled out from our student survey: more time to discuss different topics with the students from the other university, more opportunities to network with all students. But they also ask for more interaction with faculty too. And another thing to be mindful of is, even though we saw in the last slide that students had a positive experience overall, 55% of students would prefer physical mobility in the future. Again, these are quotes from our student survey. I think it's totally different to travel to the destination and know the culture at the same time you study. If it was in person, it would have made the exchange more enriching as well as interesting. Now I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague so he can guide you through the last slides of our presentation.
Thank you, Clarisa. So based on these findings, we offer some recommendations to higher education institutions which are considering implementing virtual student mobility, or those which are at different stages of implementing it. The first one is internet challenge is a problem for many students, whether in the global north or global south. So before implementing VSM, faculty should advocate, to provide internet to students, and this might entail, having pre-programmed surveys and asking who faces difficulties in accessing internet. The second one is to integrate VSM into internationalization strategies of higher education institutions, because it's an enriching experience and many students actually enjoy it. The third one is to communicate the environmental benefits, because we're surprised that very few students were aware of the environmental benefits of VSM. And the fourth one is to harness the flexibility that VSM offers, because we have seen that part-time workers and carers enjoyed the flexibility of it, and this has implications of offering it to adults and married people in light of lifelong learning. Next slide, please. So we couldn't present everything from our study, but we have a launch of our report on the February 28th, and you can use your phones to register through this QR code, or visit our website to register for the launch, where we discuss other findings from the interviews we did with international office staff and faculty which were implementing VSM. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now for our final presentation, Rajika, Bhandari, and Francesca Helm will be speaking about the Stevens Initiative 2021 Survey of Virtual Exchange Field Report. Rajika is a global expert in international higher education, author most recently of the memoir, America Calling, A Foreign Student in a Country of Possibility. Francesca is a researcher in the Department of Politics, Law, and International Studies at the University of Padova, and her research is in the area of intercultural communication and virtual exchange, online literacies, applied linguistics, education, language, policy, and ethical internationalization. I'll put a link to the report in the chat box, as well as the most recently report that was just released, I think today, by the Stevens Initiative related to the impact of learning. So I'll turn to my colleagues, Rajika and Francesca.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to all your colleagues for planning this wonderful event. I am going to share my screen and then we'll be underway soon. Wonderful, and thank you again for having us today. And before I jump into the survey, I do want to acknowledge 3 other key colleagues who partnered on this survey and led this survey, including colleagues Kyle Kassler and Henry Shepard at the Stevens Initiative, who really guided and shaped this work, as well as Melkin Ramos, who was a key researcher on the project. So to start out, I'd like to say that as Chris shared, that this is the second survey in a series. And the goal behind this work and the Stevens Initiative goal around this survey has really been to get a sense of what this phenomenon looks like globally. Because as we heard in Chris's opening remarks, virtual exchange has expanded significantly, yet while we know case studies in specific areas and regions of the world, there isn't a good sense of how do we map this activity at a global level. So that's really been the goal and purpose of this survey. And Francesca and I were delighted to be involved in the second iteration, which occurred last year, and that covered virtual exchange programs implemented between September 2020 and 2021. One of the big differences with the second survey as compared to the original one was that we were really trying to go global with this effort. So the focus was not just on virtual exchange that involves the US, but also to go much beyond that and look at virtual exchange programs that are amongst other countries, and that also include South-South exchanges. So really trying to stay true to the idea of a global survey. We managed to capture many more virtual exchange programs in the second iteration, 233 in all, but there remain key challenges around data and reporting, which we will both talk about a little bit later. Another key aspect of this survey was that it really provided an opportunity to understand what the impact of COVID-19 has been on virtual exchange programs. So that was a helpful window into looking at some of that. So who exactly did the survey cover? We reached, as I shared earlier, we reached about 233 virtual exchange programs around the world administered by a range of providers. And of those, most, over 90%, had implemented a program during the time period that we were covering through the survey. Of those who did offer virtual exchange over that period of time, about 177 were actually able to report detailed data about their virtual exchange programs. And what they shared was that they administered a total of over 3,000 programs that in turn served over 224,000 participants. Now, one thing I want to note is that for those of you who have seen the 2 survey reports, the original one as well as the one that I'm sharing now, may have noticed that even though the number of programs expanded significantly, there was not an equally high rate of increase in the number of participants. And our speculation is that the reason is that even though many more programs were covered by the survey, many programs are quite small with a small number of participants. And also it is quite possible that even though virtual exchange programs sustained through the pandemic, it's possible that they were not able to serve as many participants. So maybe that's the reason we did not see a very large increase, an equally large increase in the number of participants. Now, who's administering virtual exchange programs? And here we really see a predominance of the higher education sector, where we find that most providers are colleges and universities, followed by, actually over 50% of them, followed by non-governmental organizations that operate in more than one country. But really, we do see that very large role of higher education. Now, this could be due to a couple of different reasons. One reason could be that based on all of the outreach, despite our outreach efforts, the survey reached mainly higher education institutions. But another reason could be that even though many other types of providers are implementing virtual exchange, they may be smaller programs that don't necessarily yet have the capacity to gather and report data. Now, in looking at years, how long has virtual exchange been around? We find that it is a fairly nascent field, especially as compared to other forms of exchanges, and that most virtual education programs have been around, most providers have been implementing programs for anywhere between 1 to 5 years. Looking at who participates in these programs, here again, we really see that predominance of the higher education sector, where most participants were undergraduate students, followed by high school students, but we also find a large number of graduate students participating in these programs. Now, we know that there is a huge variation in virtual exchange, and we've already heard that in the prior two presentations as well, but indeed our survey also showed that there's a wide range of programs that fall within the definition of virtual exchange. And we started with the typology developed by the Stevens Initiative of different types of virtual exchange programs. And if you haven't seen that typology, I'd encourage you to look at it. But we refined it further to take account of some of the changes taking place in the field. So what we found was that the most common type of program is a COIL program, which is a collaborative online international learning course developed by pairs or small groups of educators working together. But the other thing I want to note is that beyond specific types of virtual exchange programs, what we found was that many programs, and especially larger programs and providers, are also offering training in virtual exchange for other programs, and thereby really helping build the capacity of the field and helping advocate for the field. Now, in terms of duration, we found that most programs are between 5 to 6 weeks. Looking at the language of programs, we see the domination of English. This comes as no surprise, given how English has really become the lingua franca of many exchange programs, including virtual exchange. However, it does possibly point to a limitation of the survey that I know Francesca will also talk more about, which is the reach of the survey and which countries we were able to capture, and whether we mostly were able to capture English-speaking programs and/or countries. Most programs use a blend of both synchronous and asynchronous learning, and there doesn't seem to be a heavy leaning towards either type. Looking finally at what's the substance or content of virtual exchange. Now, we asked respondents about 10 different areas and found that intercultural dialogue and or peace building, STEM, and global or international affairs are the top 3 areas. But beyond these, what was also really interesting is that many virtual exchange programs are really focusing on some of the most pressing and current issues of our times, including aspects such as the Sustainable Development Goals, social and racial justice issues, as well as sustainability and the environment. The last piece I want to talk about before I turn it over to Francesca is the impact of COVID that I alluded to earlier. And what we find is that while, based on what the respondents had to say, that while the pandemic has certainly offered a huge window of opportunity for virtual exchange, the negative impacts should not be discounted. And there have been programs and providers that have been negatively impacted. It's possible that much of this negative impact was felt either at the secondary school level or smaller programs where participants could not could come together in groups in person, and where even if programs sustained through the pandemic, they saw a big reduction in the actual number of participants. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Francesca.
Thank you, Rajika, and thank you, Chris, and everybody for inviting me to be here. So where is virtual exchange occurring? Despite the aim, as Rajika mentioned, to go global with this survey, unlike the previous survey, there is certainly an overrepresentation of the US. We see that the 75% of the programs reported involved the US and other countries. And then the second largest group was Europe. So again, the extent to which we were able to capture the global data, we're not sure about. But we see that, that there is activity across the globe, as this slide shows. I'm aware of time, so I'll go on to the next slide. We have learned a lot of lessons through this survey about virtual exchange, and one of these is the challenges in actually defining programs. What is virtual exchange? As Rajika mentioned, the Stevens Initiative have developed a typology of virtual exchange programs and initiatives around the world. However, we believe, people may define them differently. There may be different understandings of what a program is, of what a virtual exchange is. And again, it may be a very US-centric typology of virtual exchange, and we're exploring more different representations of virtual exchange. Nonetheless, it offers an opportunity to explore other typologies. It's always good to have something to compare. Another problem is actually in maintaining and reporting data, because depending obviously on the nature and size of an institution, it's difficult for a single individual to capture the full picture of virtual exchange at an institution. Very often it's a bottom-up activity that's happening at the classroom level. The international office or a reporting office may not be aware of what is going on within a single institution. I've already talked about the regional spread, so I won't go back into it. I think an important aspect, though, that this survey captured, which the previous survey didn't, is the role of training and professional development in virtual exchange. It's not an activity that should be improvised, and in order to ensure the quality of virtual exchange experience and student satisfaction and learning, this is an important aspect to capture in surveys. Change and growth, again, this is the second survey developed by the Stevens Initiative, and though some of the questions were the same, the aim wasn't to compare from one year to the next. We also developed this survey with additional data to the other one, and so the aim wasn't to compare, because it's still early to do this, but to have a more accurate snapshot of the global state of the art. And then thinking about the survey findings in the context of global developments in virtual exchange. Sorry, I've lost my thing. Here, again, there's a need to sensitize the field and to look at the trends, what is happening in this field, which, as we have seen, is growing rapidly. Looking ahead, there are two main issues, I think, that have been identified. How do we assess the quality of exchange programs? So this was a survey intended to map the area, to map what is happening, but it hasn't looked at the quality of virtual exchange programs. And also, how can we learn more of the way institutions ensure quality in their delivery of virtual exchange? So we clearly need to gather more qualitative data on virtual exchange to better understand the context in which it is happening. Virtual exchange is multi-layered in nature. And we need to understand, to have a more nuanced understanding of what is actually happening in the classroom, in the exchange, and the type of interactions that students are happening. And then also we need to build the capacity of institutions and organizations to gather and report and investigate the kind of virtual exchange activity they are doing. So I think up here, so we do have time for questions overall.
Great, thank you so much. You can stop sharing your screen and we'll begin a time for some questions and answers. We're going to get right to it. There were some early on questions from Sally related to the use of mobile technology, not just mobility, but the use of mobile technology. Perhaps I'll start with the group from UNESCO to talk about that, but then invite the other panelists to talk about the use of mobile technology in virtual exchange.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So we did learn from our interviews that, especially in the Global South, students were using already their mobile phones to be part of virtual student mobility programs. What I think is important here is if students are using their phones, then faculty needs to adapt in a way that they can participate in the whole virtual student mobility experience with their phones. So for example, we have a case of a university in Estonia and a university in Sri Lanka, and the students from Sri Lanka were using their phones, and to not overcomplicate things, they said, okay, we're going to just use Zoom and a Google Drive folder, not to use more sophisticated or more other applications that maybe need a laptop, so that both students from Estonia and students from Sri Lanka could participate in all the activities of the program.
Great, I appreciate that perspective. We had a series of questions related to just the subject area content. I know the first presenter, Sara, spoke to this in terms of the types of courses that are involved, but also the final presenters talked about in terms of the content focus. If I can summarize the questions, they're broadly related to the types of subjects that are being focused on and how they compared to perhaps physical exchange, and particularly, I think, the trends that you would see in the future in terms of the kinds of subject areas where there might be some growth and value in virtual exchange as it relates to student learning. Let's start with Sara, and then Rajika and Francesca can respond after that.
Yes, as I was saying before, most of the cases we mapped and then selected are based on the humanities, although we had some examples of interdisciplinary projects if we are focusing on content in the virtual exchange initiatives. And there is a very, very successful example of interdisciplinary project between engineering students and students of English in the shared garden example. This is an example you can find in the report, where you can see, the benefits from students from Bordeaux University and another university who joined forces and tried to identify solutions in terms of gardens from different perspectives. From what I can see and from what we were sharing within the consortium, there are some potential scenarios we have not been investigating because we feel there is still a high potential which has not been exploited yet. And I'm referring, for example, in terms of disciplines to STEM disciplines, hard sciences, where there seems to be still some hurdles there are some hurdles in terms of how the virtual exchange experience is perceived in terms of content. And that is where training become essential and important to make staff, teaching staff understand the potential for students to participate in those training. I think I've covered the question. I'll leave the floor to other panelists.
Thank you. How about Rajika and Francesca?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and then Francesca might have more to add. I think in the case of the types of virtual exchange programs that we were looking at through the survey and through the Stevens Initiatives Network, really the main motivation of the programs has been as a form of exchange to build collaboration and mutual understanding. And I think given that original vision, what we see in the topics, therefore, is really the predominance of areas such as global affairs, international relations, and some of the emerging areas around sustainable development, etc. So the idea being that how can that reciprocity and mutual exchange really help also tackle broader global and social issues. So that's sort of my take on that, but let me turn it over to Francesca in terms of the content of the virtual exchange or what might be sort of driving some of that content.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Obviously, most subjects that lend themselves to intercultural comparisons or that have a global dimension. But I think, and we've seen it also in the field of business and management where they have a strong interest in it, but also health and many other fields. I think, though, that any project really can, it just perhaps requires a greater step of the imagination to develop an exchange. And as Sara mentioned, I think interdisciplinary projects, transdisciplinary projects are good opportunities to also develop this kind of intercultural and transdisciplinary dimension through virtual exchange.
All right. Well, we certainly have had a great exchange of perspectives and conversation today, and I'm sure this conversation could continue. I think there's been an active chat conversation going on. I know many of the presenters addressed some of your questions in the chat box, but I do want to thank all of you for attending today from the Center for International Higher Education. I wanted to remind all of you, we've shared links in the chat box to all of the wonderful websites and reports that our presenters have shared. I think, as you can see, this is a very nascent area in terms of research. So there's many new questions and much space for new researchers and research to take place. So we hope this is not just an opportunity for you to learn about the research, but it sparks some new research questions and also created some new connections. You can see who's joined the conversation today, as well as the contact information of our presenters, whether that be on social media or email from their websites. I would encourage you also to subscribe to International Higher Education. That's the journal from the center. It's the oldest and most widely published journal. It's existed for 25 years, and it's been translated in many languages on a regular basis, and it's completely open access. And it's a place where you can get the latest news and analysis on international higher education. But we do thank you for joining us today. We do thank our presenters as well. We hope this has been an intellectually stimulating conversation. I know it has been for me. Thank you for joining us for the Center for International Higher Education webinar. We will send you more information on future webinars that are coming up in the months ahead. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a good evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you might be joining us from. Thank you.
Bye.